We're here in deepest Cornwall today, and I'm talking with Sue. We decided that we would talk about the Freedom Programme, and the book is new to both of us in a sense. Neither of us has really read it beforehand, and so what we're going to do is just talk about it chapter by chapter, with pauses in between, so that it doesn't become just too long. What more can we say about it? My name's David Higgins. I work as a facilitator for temper domestic violence, delivering courses with violent and abusive and aggressive men and women.
I'm Sue Parker Hall. I'm a psychotherapist and a counsellor and author of Anger, Rage and Relationship. And I work individually with people, men and women, with rage issues. And my approach is a non-gendered one, which is why I'm quite keen to have a look at the Freedom Project and
what it all means, in a sense, or what we construe that it means. Yes, and our programme with perpetrators is also, or with people with abusive behaviours, I think is a word I prefer much more to perpetrators, because the word perpetrator implies that somebody is guilty of a criminal offence, which in some cases the people will have been tried and found guilty, and in many other cases, of course, they're being made perpetrators by accusation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So this is the book that we've been looking at, and we started looking at it probably about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour ago.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 is the introduction. So we'll make some progress with that. I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit first, Sue, or whether I'll talk a little bit, but we'll see how it goes, shall we?
Okay.
So what strikes you from your first reading of this, Sue?
Well, the introduction is quite tantalising in a way. The author had a revelation and said that she found herself colluding with every man she'd ever worked with, but didn't say how. And she also talked about information she felt she had that no one else that she was working with had. And so I'm intrigued about that too. And she mentions her understanding that most women who are abused have no idea of what happened to them. So I found those three things tantalising and interesting. And the other thing that struck me, which has often been a criticism I've had of the Duluth-based model, the model based on radical feminism, is the men are not allowed to discuss their personal circumstances. They're not allowed to tell their story. And to my mind, anger and rage issues are all about trauma, and the only really long-lasting solution is to actually tell the story, to
begin to move that through their system a little bit.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Yes, precisely.
Yeah, I think those were some of the things which struck me as well, that I'm going to use the word perpetrator, although I don't like it, but just for the pure convenience of it, that a perpetrator is a perpetrator and a victim is a victim. And of course, part of the problem which we see is that at any particular given moment, either might be victim or perpetrator. And that if we're working with a perpetrator, then that perpetrator has almost definitely been a victim at some time in the past in their life. And that the emotional memories of the victimhood which they've experienced also direct, if you like, the emotional take which they have on all subjects. And so I think without exploring the victimhood of the individual, then there's going to be precious little change brought about. That would be my take on it as well. Yeah.
What struck you from looking at the introduction?
That basically, what's she called? Pat Craven had been a probation officer for quite a long period of time, and she seemed to be saying that she'd worked with quite a number of men who were murderers. And if we take the statistics of that time, which she mentions a little bit later on, I think in chapter 2, that 112 women a year are killed by their partner or former partner. And there are something like 52 counties in the country, and I don't know quite what area a probation service covers, but if there are 52, then that would almost imply that there are like 2 murderers per county per year. And so if there are 2 murderers per county per year going into the prison because of the murder that they committed, I'm assuming that there are only going to be 2 per year coming out of the probation service, or coming out via the probation service. And so it sounded to me as if there would be quite a considerable difference in the exaggeration which I would perceive her putting on the number of male murderers that she found.
It didn't quite resonate.
It didn't quite resonate with me, no. In our experience, I'm not aware that we've worked with any man that's been a murderer out of more than 1,000 men that we've completed work with. We've completed work with just over 100 women, and I am aware of at least one of the women that was a murderess, interestingly enough. So goodness knows what that means, but you know, our experiences differ quite significantly there. So. So the introduction also tells us that Pat was running, or Pat's organisation was running perpetrator programmes which lasted 1 weekend. And I can go along with the intensive format of that because I think one of the big difficulties with the Duluth model is that with 26 to 32 weeks being a fairly standard requirement, that men just drop out for a whole list of reasons. And not only that, the facilitators also can't manage to be maintained over that period of time through their own illness and sickness, and so facilitators just get changed around. So I think the model of working at weekends, which is one which we've also adopted and been working at for 25 years, I think that's constructive. However, what sounds to be happening is that these are big groups, and I'm quite aware that the probation service likes to work and on the IDAP program, which I imagine was what Pat worked on for some time. That got abandoned in about 2012, and I imagine that that was because the outcomes from it were very, very poor indeed. And or it might be according to the fact that that the probation service sort of outsourced its much of its service to the CRCs, the community rehabilitation companies, and they picked up and ran a different program called Building Better Relationships. And the latest reports I was reading from the HM Inspectorate of Probation or Prisons or CRCs was saying that the outcomes from that are pretty abysmal as well. So I think the guts of it is that the model which has been being used for a considerable period of time is absolutely rife with failure. One of those failures was, as Pat was quite correctly trying to observe, that you need to have work which is intensive, which men can complete, but if you have large groups of people, then you obviously can't explore what's going on. And a client that we've recently had who went to a community-based accredited program where he was one of 16 individuals, the report at the end of this said that he had really not taken part in the way which they would have liked him to have taken part. And when I do the mathematics and work out that in a 2-hour passage with 16 people there, his opportunity for taking part would have maybe been about 5 minutes if he'd been one of these sort of get my bit in kind of people, which he wasn't. And so without being invited to speak, his whole input would be very, very minor indeed, because that was the way that he'd been brought up, in a sense, to be seen and not heard, which was clearly what he was still doing at the age of 35, 36, 37, but nevertheless a highly intelligent man. An interesting thing,
It is. Well, one of my criticisms of the Duluth model was that it was a one-size-fits-all. And it was also that it was a kind of program of political indoctrination. It wasn't evidence-based or practice-based. And one of the prime indicators of that is that it just didn't change or develop over over the years. It stayed the same.
I think that's right. 2012, I think it was, Louise Dixon produced a very trenchant paper which said that there was no evidence based on what they were doing, and was actually calling for the Duluth model, which was respect, which was what respect was accrediting, that it should be simply abandoned.
Yes.
And there were other papers around the same time which were really calling for the same thing. However, it has somehow survived.
And we're both curious to see the echoes of it or not.
Yes, that's
in
right.
this Freedom Project.
Yes, and the Freedom Programme picked up a good deal of criticism from Respect for reasons which I can begin to understand, that if you're working with a large group of people, all you're attempting to do really is to give them new vocabulary or something like that, so that they will learn the words, but they won't learn the music which goes with it. And with that kind of analogy, I think the difference between the one weekend where they worked and the 2 weekends where we work is that we're also bringing the people into contact with the music. So it's not really about words at all. It's about all of the music, so that they can play the whole the whole orchestra will be brought into play. The orchestra will be brought into use rather than just the words which somebody's remembered of the poem or something like that.
So shall we read on?
Yes, let's read on and then see where we go from. We're now going to move on to chapter 2, which is called not the denominator, but the dominator. And stated at the top of the page is, in Britain, 112 women a year are killed by a male partner or former partner, Home Office statistics 2007. In Britain, 22 men a year are killed by a female partner or former partner, Home Office 2007. Those figures may well be correct. I think a more up-to-date figure for the number of women that are killed is somewhere around the 75 to 78 mark. But noticeably omitted is the number of children that get killed by their parents, which comes to about 65 children per year. And of those 65 children that are killed per year by parents, at least 65 children, those are the ones that certainly are discovered, if you like, they're killed in more or less equal numbers by mothers and fathers. Okay, and the very young children tend to be killed by the mother, and the older children tend to be killed by the father. Just an interesting little additional statistic, and also flagging up the fact that all of this is focused at violence against women rather than violence against children, which in many respects needs to be the firmest focus, because that leaves us away from this potential gender war which is going on.
Absolutely. These deaths are all tragedies, aren't they?
Absolutely.
They're absolute tragedies.
Yeah.
And what worries me so much is that I don't think we properly understand why these deaths are happening.
Yeah.
I think we have a misunderstanding of why they're happening, and that has serious consequences for the treatment
of the individuals involved.
Exactly.
Yes, I agree entirely with that.
Yeah.
I think some of the attachment theory begins to look at the differences between securely attached and insecurely and anxiously attached individuals and avoidant individuals, and that some much greater study of that is required. There's a great deal of research being carried out on attachment theory, and I think that can certainly lead to much better potential outcomes by therapists and others working in this domain.
And I would say, along with trauma theory and developmental trauma and life experience trauma, these are kind of important factors, aren't they?
I think that's right. And another of the difficulties is that everything is being brought under the male power and control idea as well.
Yes.
So within the chapter then, she focuses on the dominator is his name and controlling women is his game. So we have the sexual controller, the king of the castle, the bad father, the liar, the persuader, the head worker, the jailer, and the bully. A little bit later, I noticed that there's not a saint, that we are seeing, just a decent human being. So this is, the small minority of men that exist.
There's a polarising here, isn't there?
Yeah,
Which I think is really unhelpful.
Yeah.
And those terms are all so derogatory.
Yes, that's right.
All of them.
Yeah.
And they're a mirror, aren't they, for the old power and control wheel. On the power and control wheel, there were 8 different
That's right.
ways in which men abuse women,
Yeah.
and they've just been transferred to different characters now, haven't they?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, so it's exactly the same.
Yeah, and the woman that developed the power and control wheel was the late Ellen Pence.
Yes.
And in her book here, which I don't know whether that can be seen, but this was what she said in 19...
Hold it a bit closer.
Well, yes, I think, yeah, okay. I think that's probably okay. What she said here on page 28-29 was, the power and control wheel, which was developed by battered women attending men's groups, was originally a description of typical behaviours accompanying the violence. In effect, it said, when he is violent, he gets power and he gets control. Somewhere early in this, organising our efforts, however, we changed the message to, he is violent in order to get power and control. The difference is not semantic, it is ideological. Okay? And a little bit further down, she recognises that the vast majority of the men with whom she worked didn't express any desire for power and control over the woman that they were living with whatsoever, and recognised then that they were at error with that. The really sad thing is that has not been recognised by, if I say the powers that be, I'm using those words again, but the powers that be, and it persists until this day, although the guru quite clearly stated and recognised that it wasn't there. If we look at some of the other statistics, then Johnson is a so-called feminist researcher or sympathetic to feminism, certainly. And the statistics which I read and digest from him were that prior to separation, his research found 7 men per 1,000 that were intimate terrorists or coercive controllers, whichever of those 2 terms you prefer to use, and that 5 women per 1,000 were intimate terrorist coercive controllers prior to separation. Post-separation, the figure for men exploded enormously to 22% of men being coercive controllers and 4.7, I think it was, percent of women post-separation that became coercive controllers. So one can see that this, when men enter the battle then, and the battle is usually about access to the children who are very largely placed with the woman, that the men do begin to fight and they do begin to become sort of setting out to win, and in a kind of war zone, which is what they're invited to do by the British court system. Inevitably, almost, they begin to start using all of the mechanisms which are at their disposal, as do the women. So, a great deal of difficulty there, and a great deal of animosity is actually built up by, I think, the court system. But if we go back to the...
I wanted to also talk about the statistics, because I was thinking of the work of, John Archer, Louise Dixon, Nicola Kevin Graham, who in their various universities have their
Liz
research,
Bates as well,
and Liz Bates as well. Their research shows much more
equality, symmetry between,
in terms of male and female violence. They even show that young women dating are likely to be more violent than young men dating. And then there's the American Centre for Disease Control, who quite recently, their research shows that gay men experience domestic abuse just as often, and lesbian partners experience it more so.
Yes, I think those statistics have been around for quite a long period of time, but of course, if they don't match what it is that you're wanting, then they're happily ignored.
Well, that kind of makes a nonsense, doesn't it, of the gender model, of looking at it through a gender lens.
Of course, the difficulty is, though, that if patriarchy is your game, then of course you can't have anything which contradicts that. And
Yes.
so, you know,
Yes.
male abuse amongst males, so gay violence, if you like, and lesbian violence, obviously those are anathema to the feminist model.
Yes,
And
exactly.
just as is female violence, and probably for that reason, the accreditor Respect has actually, as far as I know, initiated no courses with female abusers, and in fact, female abusers tend to be sent on the Freedom Programme, which is largely focused on female victims of domestic violence. Which was how I came into contact with this book originally.
Absolutely.
From a female abuser, recognizing herself as a female abuser, who was it was being insisted that she should go on the Freedom Programme for female victims.
Yes.
Yeah. Interestingly enough.
And I was thinking also, if you're looking through that feminist lens, it is a feminist lens, that it's about keeping women under control, then you can't take any other causes into account, can you?
Yeah.
So Pat Craven says drink, stress, unemployment, overwork, low self-esteem, insecurity are excuses.
Yeah.
Whereas you and I as a therapist might say they're part of an explanation.
Of course, yeah.
And the most glaring omission is developmental and life experience trauma.
Yeah.
There's no conceptualisation of that within the model so far.
That's right. We've only seen 1 and 2.
I
That's
think
correct.
we're probably anticipating what's to come. But
I think maybe yes by now.
Yeah.
And I think one of the other difficulties is it's always the men which have these problems. As a former couple counsellor, then of course we would see a lot of these problems also in women's hands as well. So, and
absolutely.
Very recently I was listening to a case where the woman of the relationship had a £300 a month gambling habit, and when the husband or partner attempted to put some boundaries around this, because the family just could not afford £300 a month in gambling, and men gamble as well. Don't get me wrong. It needs to be managed. But then all of a sudden, then he's coercively controlling her by attempting to take away the finance with which she's gambling.
Right.
So, if the man was doing that, he would be absolutely guilty. But with the women doing that, or the woman doing that, then he's coercively controlling her, or attempting to coercively.
So there's a kind of double standard operating.
A kind of ridiculous thing which ignores the kind of problems which go on in couple relationships from top to bottom, really. That's a somewhat more extreme view. I mean, there are much more extreme views than that, and there are also much lighter situations than that. So I can think back to a very early client we had who required his tea on the table at 6:30 on the basis that if they were eating after 7 o'clock, that would cause him indigestion, and then he wouldn't be able to sleep. So those were things which he'd just been brought up with. Presumably, his mother would say, "Well, we've got to eat at 6:30." That was what their family required, and so he just goes on willy-nilly and reproduces that in his own relationship, and is then very upset with his wife or partner when the food is not on the table at 6:30. And was that about being coercive and controlling? Goodness only knows, but I'm sure it could be seen as that if you chose to. Yeah.
Controlling is an element for sure.
Yes.
But it's a dynamic that people use as a survival strategy.
Yeah.
It's not a willful.
Not necessarily a willful thing. It's about divergent views about how something should happen. That's right. Neither person's got the right answer to that.
It's often about not being able to manage an unpredictable environment or a change because the person hasn't got the emotion processing capacity to cope with that.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes, so they're not able to remain flexible enough.
Exactly.
I think that would be
that's a good way of putting
terms.
it. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yes, the dominator. Yeah. So, anything else that struck you out of that then, Sue?
Just one more thing. The idea that these behaviours are a product of society
Yeah.
I think it's a very one-dimensional view.
Yeah.
And it leads to a very one-dimensional intervention.
Yeah.
It's all about beliefs.
Yeah.
The beliefs are a product of society.
Yeah.
We simply change people's beliefs, which we know as therapists, you can't maintain a changed belief under stress.
No, and a belief doesn't necessarily equate with behaviour anyway. So,
yeah, good point.
I think one of the other things which struck me in this, and I've forgotten what it was now, so I'll just stop it there for a moment. One of the other things which struck me from this was the way that it was being described that the men all learn the same language, which reminds me of the way that parents often talk when they say, I can hear my mother saying exactly the same things that I'm saying to our children now. You know, so and then there's that lovely song written, I'm the mum, I'm the mum, I'm the mum. I don't know whether you came across that, but to the sort of William Tell overture or something like that. Wash your teeth, do your thing, you know.
Brush your hair.
Yeah, brush your hair, do you what you call, do you this, do you that, catch your, do you think, were you born in a barn? You know, so all of that kind of stuff, which are kind of just regenerated or regurgitated aspects from an individual's own childhood. So.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I was just focusing a little bit on the 1996 version, potted version of psychology, which was very popular at the time, which was stating the controller being a snake who actually loses, who has no emotional response, and all of the behaviour which the snake perpetrates is kind of cold and controlling and goal directed towards getting the person into the position that they want, so that they can either eat them or bite them or goodness knows what.
Yes.
And the other side was described as the pit bull then, so somebody whose emotions are engaged by what's gone on, and they then get heated. And the guy was suggesting that if you could take the individual's blood pressure at the time, you would find that the snake's blood pressure drops. Yes. And the pit bull's blood pressure actually rises.
Yes.
And that would fit with the way in which we look at people, where primary emotions are emotional responses which come about by reaction, and secondary emotions come about via the thought process. But of course, if I start to report that this was a reaction, then it's a reaction to something. And the reaction to then is automatically blaming the partner, because the partner has produced the stimulus for whatever the reaction was. And therefore this would fall under partner blaming.
Yes.
Okay, so it's quite an interesting scenario.
But I see the snake and the pit bull behaviours as trauma behaviours.
Yes.
When people aren't in
in kind of phase or something.
When they're not in the window of tolerance, they're either hyper aroused or hypo aroused. And they're not in touch with their best thinking. They're not in touch with their emotions that can give them some good information about what's going on around here, what's needed. So you get an explosive response, as you say, or a kind of cold closing down, withdrawal response. What I would call hot rage and cold rage.
Okay. That's right. Our views on that maybe differ a little bit.
We have different views,
but
don't we?
That's right.
Yeah.
I think I would tend to see rage as being anger upon anger upon anger, and would look at the bull in the bull ring who is picked by the picadors until the bull actually won't take any more picking, and then begins to attack. So,
whereas I see rage as a whole load of different emotions that haven't been able to be processed and integrated. So there is anger in there, but there's also usually a lot of grief, a lot of hurt, a lot of fear.
Right. Okay. So I see. So you would see that as an agglomeration, really, of emotions.
Yes, exactly.
And we, in the work that we do, we try to actually separate those out so that men come to understand the individual components of that.
Yes.
So that begin to recognize themselves, giving themselves a little bit of time then to process what's going on in them,
Yes.
recognize themselves, we would describe that in fear or
Yes.
in grief or also in disgust.
Yes.
Okay, so that and so that they build in a little bit of time, so that they're much less in a reactive format and rather more in a reflective format. But that's, and that would be where we would see as being part of the process which we engage in.
Yes, I'm just trying to, Yes, similarly, the men and women that I've been working with, 96% of them have never learned how to emotionally regulate themselves. They don't know the name of individual emotions. Yes. They tend to, if you ask them how they are or what's going on for them, they've got very, very limited vocabulary.
Yeah.
And they're likely to say, I'm shit or I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm good or I'm bad.
With no differentiation really between them. I think that's also a part of the work which we undertake as well. That, and you're talking about women that are making those descriptions. I think it's even more so with men.
No, men and women.
Well, yes, I'm saying I think the problem is more severe with men because at least by popular opinion, men are more distant from their emotions than most women. But
I'm
not so sure about that.
No,
I think it's just verbalized in different ways, maybe, or expressed in different ways.
Could well be.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, and on page 20, then she trots out this this idea that the societal norm says that the rule of thumb is a societal norm which says that a woman may be beaten by a stick which is no thicker than a man's thumb, or words to that effect. What's your view on that, Sue?
Well, I would kind of defer to Christina Hoff Summers.
Oh, right, okay. Who's she?
The thoughtful feminist.
Oh, right, a thoughtful feminist, right.
Yeah,
okay.
So she calls it a feminist fiction.
Right.
She said that actually, beating of women did occur, and it was differentially policed or differentially treated in the courts.
Yeah.
But it was never in the
never
British
written into
common
social
law.
No,
it was never in British common law.
No, I could well imagine that is exactly right.
So it wasn't a rule of thumb.
Yeah,
that you
that's
could
right. Yeah.
Use.
And the other complaint which many feminists make is that men are protecting women that don't need protecting at one level, and all of which would come under this term of not patriarchy, but of I can't think of the right term now, but chivalry. Okay, so chivalrous behaviour towards women, which would be to look out for and protect and do things like that. And it would seem to me to be in complete contrast to everything which chivalry has been brought about. And when she draws attention to violence in films and things like that, which obviously men are involved in much more than women, because women have been prevented from going to war, because war has been seen as something which is
they've been protected from going to war.
Yeah, they've been protected, yes. Prevented or protected, that's right. Yeah. Yes. So I think, and then goes on to describe then that men are kind of trained to bully. All of the training for soldiers is about training by sergeant majors, for example, which we've all seen and experienced in films. As being fairly typical.
But it's another caricature, isn't it? It's another stereotype.
It is a caricature and it is a stereotype. But one of the problems which we have to remember that soldiers face is that they're being expected to go to war and to do things which the whole of their upbringing, or religious upbringing certainly, has told them they shouldn't do. Thou shalt not kill. It's pretty much number one on the agenda for at least for past generations. And then all of a sudden they're required to kill. And when I was reading bits about this, they were saying that one of the great difficulties for the army was to actually get men to be in a position that they would kill the enemy. They would fire in any kind of direction apart from to kill the opposition. which is,
Yes.
in terms of war, exactly what's required of you.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, we've had a recent case where all of a sudden there were an individual brought a large number of affidavits about his good behaviour.
Yes.
And in thinking about this in supervision, it suddenly became clear to me that if I think in terms of soldiers going off to war and being traumatized by the war, so the trauma would tend to come, as my belief was, from the outside. So this was about things which they'd had done to them or things which they'd experienced or seen, and that would cause the trauma. But of course it then became clear that the trauma for some of these men would be upsetting to think about it, in what they'd actually had to do themselves.
Yes.
And so their view of themselves under these warlike conditions would have suddenly been shattered. And I think that in the case of this particular individual, he was needing all of these positive affidavits to tell him that he was the man that he believed he was, rather than the man that he'd been discovered to be, I think, and discovered to be is perhaps not too wrong a word. So.
I think killing is so counterintuitive, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there is undoubtedly a group of people that are able to kill with impunity, in a sense, that's right. But by and large, it's a very small group, and by and large, they're also motivated by a very deep personal interest. So, we've got the murders going on around up in the stabbings and killings going up around in the large cities at the moment, which are very often associated with drug dealing and the kind of very very subversive business at the best of times. So I think so. There are definitely a group of people that are quite able to do that with impunity as far as their conscience and everything else is concerned. But the vast majority of people don't get anywhere close to that, I would say.
Absolutely. So we're asking a lot of service men and women.
That's right.
To a greater extent, service men.
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the other depressing things I read about about people coming back from war zones, Afghanistan and places like that, was that they tended to be dropped. They have what's called decompression, so they're dropped off in. I think it was there's Malta, and then the next island over is, I've forgotten what it is, just on the spur of the moment. Northern. Oh God, I can't think of it. But anyway, the men are dropped off back there, and they're given enough money to go uptown and get roundly pissed, and that's called decompression. 2 days, and then they're back into the United Kingdom with all kinds of underlying problems which have just been stirred up by their experiences of war, one way or the other. So, in a way, quite depressing and quite, one might almost say, inhuman that they're not able to come back and be with their families in a much more sensible way. So.
And as you're talking, I'm thinking of not thinking well of oneself or feeling oneself is bad as a symptom of trauma, where what's happened to the person was bad, but they haven't yet separated from that. So it becomes, that was bad, I'm bad.
Yes.
Whereas once you've processed it, you can see something bad happened to me.
Yes.
But there's no separation
until
that's right. That processing happens.
The work of the therapist is actually to help that separation take place, isn't it? And to, in a sense, restore the individual to the person which they believe themselves to have been.
Which they truly are.
And they've had to integrate the other aspects of themselves. Okay.
So again, I'm reminded of the positive power and control wheel. Where there's always a positive equivalent or behaviour. So here, instead of the bully, the counterpart is the friend. And again, I'm struck by the way this is written is you're one or the other. You're either the bully or you're the friend. Whereas most of us are a bit both.
That's right. We're a complete and utter mixture of, if you like, good and bad, if one wants to polarize things in those ways, or shades of grey might be a better way. And the friend emblem is
really quite idealised, just as the bully
Yeah,
is demonised.
yeah, yeah,
And polarities always disturb me,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. Yeah, what we need is 20 shades of grey without all the stuff which goes with it. That's right.
Yeah.
Chapter 4 is the bad father, which I guess we could
Yeah.
take a little break and then go on and worry about the bad father.
Yes.
I must admit that I'd always considered myself to be a pretty good father. You know, I've got my difficulties in treating children equally. We were very fortunate to have twins when my wife was 36 and I was, I think, 32. And so I would anticipate that I would have treated both of these twins absolutely equally.
Oh.
However, I had a very rude awakening one day when I was dealing with my tropical fish tank, cleaning it out, probably for the first time in the year, you know, getting no bonus points for that. And all of a sudden there was a noise coming from behind me, to which I then barked out, "Oh, for God's sake, shut up!" and turned round and saw that it was the other. "Oh, it's you." So there were two different things. When I'd taken the messages coming from one twin, it was obviously on my case. But when it was coming from the other twin, then it was quite all right. It was really quite a profound shock to my system. I would have always considered that I treated both of these boys similarly.
Right.
But in fact, in that moment, I had to discover that that was not the case. And a bit later on, of course, I then looked at, began to think, well, what is the difference between these two?
Yeah.
And at some point in the past, somebody had used this, so when one starts pointing the accusing finger, it's usually about the problems which one's got oneself, which are non-integrated. And I can remember later on with this twin, looking at his signature and thinking, "Wow, God, that's a ridiculous signature. You know, that's no good whatsoever. You know, that's going to run him down."
Yeah.
And then, within a very few minutes, looking at my own signature and thinking, "Bloody hell, it's very similar to mine." That's right. So I think the message about the similarities between me and, let's say, twin number one, and the differences between me and twin number two, those have been the kind of dividing points between us about. Would I say that I love both of them equally? Well, I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
But I've got a different behaviour towards one than to the other, and I don't know quite what that's based on, other than my own failings. So. Sad, isn't it? Got to get to 70 before you recognise things like that.